Assalamu alaikum. Continuing our discussion from the previous topic, literary theorizing from Aristotle to Leavis, today we'll look into a few more of the writers who contributed to the growth of literary theory. So, in our previous discussion, we saw Aristotle, his uh, his critical theory as to his contribution in terms of poetics, his definitions, his suggestions for plot progress, his approach, reader-centered approach. Then we saw Sir Philip Sidney with his Apology for Poetry, where he expanded upon certain classic writers and their definitions. And yes, then we saw Samuel Johnson, Dr. Johnson's Lives of Poets and Prefaces to Shakespeare, how they contributed to the large amount of practical criticism, and where he really laid down the rules for sort of started the trend of practical criticism. And then we saw William Wordsworth in the Romantic Age with his preface to his lyrical ballads, where he devised a new form of diction for writing, and where he understood literature against other kinds of writing, and his rationale for his own poetic work. Again, we saw Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who had certain exceptions to Wordsworth's writings, Wordsworth's viewpoints, sorry, not writings, viewpoints on the diction, how it impoverished the very nature of poetry. And then we also saw how aesthetic, Coleridge believed that aesthetic effect could only be created with the fictive qualities, the imaginative qualities of language, without which literary work could not really be effective. Then we saw Shelley with his defense of poetry, where he anticipated certain concepts way before his time, especially the concepts of defamiliarization, conscious and unconscious. Then we saw Eliot, whereas we should have moved on to Keats because Keats is a romantic poet and should be seen along with Shelley, Coleridge, and Wordsworth. But then, yes, we went to Eliot and we looked at the role of the tradition in the production of any work by an individual. So we saw the notion of impersonality and then dissociation of sensibility and objective correlative. And we also understood how Eliot laid the foundation for the symbolist movement for later on. Then today, yes, of course, today we'll be looking at John Keats. Keats, while being a romantic, he did not write any formal literary theory like Wordsworth or Coleridge. Rather, he wrote letters. Okay, and these letters were written to his brothers and friends, but these letters contained no um, in a sustained manner, consistently. So you see, he reflected upon the conscious and unconscious much like Shelley, but then he was more specific. Look at his definition of the imaginative mind here. He says the simple imaginative mind, that our actual mind he's talking about here. The simple imaginative mind may have its rewards. No, it may have its gift in the repetition of its own silent working. Here, silent working would be the unconscious. There is something working within our minds without our conscious effort. Okay, now this, working coming continually on the spirit with a fine suddenness. Now, spirit would be our conscious part of the mind, silent working, unconscious part of our mind, spirit, the conscious part of mind. Now, try to connect both of this. So, when the unconscious mind is working towards some inspiring thought or fancy or it's just working to create something, it puts in those thoughts or pushes them to the conscious part of our brains, and we tend to become inspired. What Plato, Aristotle, all of them spoke about inspiration, right? So this is what he's talking about. They are talking about inspiration. The spirit is inspired. Okay. Now once the spirit is inspired, the mind consciously with the working of the unconscious part produces a creative work. Okay, now again, this privileging of the unconscious over the conscious could be seen in his explanation for negative capability. Now, negative capability would be what when a man is capable of being in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. So in one, in his in a letter to his brothers, he speaks of how when we are capable of being uncertain, when we don't hanker after a particular answer or reason or fact, we are giving in to negative capability, which is a basic requirement, because most of the things that occur in the unconscious part of mind, they do not really need to be answered. They don't really require validity through facts, external facts. Only when we give into it, when we abandon this quest, would be able to produce a decent literary work, or even appreciate a decent literary work. I believe most of you are familiar with Keats' Ode to Nightingale, or maybe Ode on a Grecian Urn. Just look at Ode on Grecian Urn. There are so many unanswered questions, but the very uncertainty in which the urn existed itself brought beauty to it. Well, then we move on to we'll just look at a few of the Victorian critics: George Eliot, Maxi Arnold, Henry James, John Ruskin, Walter Pater. Now, when we speak of George Eliot, she was mainly concerned with the classical and continental writers with philosophical issues. So her main concern was the classics and the continental writers. And she also dealt with realism. Okay. And she also applied whatever she preached or whatever theories she devised in her own work. So when you look at her novels, what you see, it is extremely realistic in nature. She believed that the characters need not be flawless, which is, of course, that is the real condition of the human state, human mind. So Eliot was concerned with the real issues of the genre of novel. And then we see Matthew Knowles. He brought in this devices touchstone method to evaluate a critical work, a literary work. Then we see Henry James, who was mostly concerned with the novel. In fact, he went to the extent of saying that novel itself is not a serious literary form, but then he wrote extensively upon this genre. And of course, he was concerned with realism as well. Then we see John Ruskin. Ruskin devised many cultural theories and theories on criticism on the art and architecture of his time and of the Grecian art and architecture of the previous ages. But as far as his criticism on literature is concerned, he devised certain, certain moral stands he believed were necessary for appreciation of literature. And he also is known for coining this term called pathetic fallacy. Pathetic fallacy would be something that, wherein certain attributes, human attributes, are given to inanimate objects or things, non-human things. Walter Pater, his impressions are what he called impressions, were later on known to be individual subjective expressions, because as opposed to Arnold, who believed in objective assessment, Walter Pater believed in subjective assessment of a literary work. He believed that a work should be seen first and foremost from the critic's own point of view. The critic himself should develop a sense, of course, just like Arnold says, but then a critic should have to know why he likes a work, what is the reason behind a work impressing upon one's self. So now we'll look at Maxi Arnold a little more extensively. He wrote quite a bit on criticism. Despite being a poet, he was mainly known for his criticism. His work on criticism, function of criticism at the present time, and the study of poetry were quite important in his time, during his time, because it really questioned the existence of critics. Okay, not exactly questioned it, it validated the place of critics in the realm of literature, literary study. Why do we need criticism? Why do we need critics? That was a question he asked. See, he also saw literature as a possible replacement for religion. Why do we need to replace religion? See, what happened was during and after the Industrial Revolution, and of course after the advent of the scientific discoveries, Charles Darwin's evolution theory of evolution, origin of species, people, in general, were running thin on their faith. Their faith in the Bible, their faith in the church was running thin. So the moral standards were declining to some degree. There were people who were moving away from their roots. There were like mass movement from villages to the cities. They were looking for work in the cities after the Industrial Revolution. Most of them lost their lands and their living. To find a living, they did come to the cities, and so they were moving away from the roots, from their own roots, and they were at a point where they had no anchor to, or no compass to guide them. So Arnold believed that literature could replace religion here, because literature has the has the potential to guide and teach and sustain mankind for some time. A critic. So why do we need a critic? Arnold believed that a critic can help recognize the best that has been known and thought in the world. That we know, again, as I have spoken earlier, there is good literature and bad literature. There are all kinds of literature, but only a critic would be, Arnold believes, would be in a position to know what that which is best. Okay, and direct the people to read those books that has been known and thought in the world. That way, literature could serve the purpose of religion. It has to be disinterested. A critic, or in terms of what the nature of the critic should be, he says a critic should be disinterested. Here, disinterested does not mean uninterested. I have already spoken about it earlier. Here, disinterested simply mean not taking a political stand. Political stand is in not taking a stand with a particular group, or a particular objective, or particular or idea. Just being uncommitted. Okay, so only when you're uncommitted, only when a critic is not committed to a particular cause, that critic have pure disinterested knowledge. Pure disinterested knowledge as in a knowledge that does not favor any group or section of society or ideology. So the object could then be seen as in itself it really is. This is one of the famous quotes of Arnold, where he believes that an object, any literary work, should be seen for what it is worth, rather than compare it or see it in other terms, in any external effect or cause or reason. He also, so a critic has to be disinterested. Disinterest would be the nature of the critic. Now, the method of criticism, he speaks of, speaking of the method of criticism, he talks about touchstone method. Now, what is touchstone? A touchstone would be a method that judges the value of a particular work in comparison to other works of great writers. So he says one has to have always in mind lines and expressions of the great masters and apply them as a touchstone to other poetry. So here he speaks of great masters. Particularly, I believe he chose some 11 parts of different works. And if I'm right, there was Dante and Shakespeare and a few other writers he thought were great masters, who were really good enough, great enough to set standards for other kinds of writing. So he believed that if you have, read really good works in literature, your mind would be in a position to evaluate the contemporary work or any other work, whether it is good or bad, whether it has a certain standard or how well that new work could measure up against the works of the great masters. So, yeah, touchstone, it is a little flawed because these great masters, they were restricted in their creativity, because they wrote certain kinds of works, and later on there were so many other kinds of writing that that cannot in any sense measure up to these works, the writings of these great masters, mainly because of the differences in the genre themselves, the differences in the genre, the ages in which they are produced, the languages that are being used, in that respective age. All of these contribute to the factor that touchstone method cannot be indiscriminately applied to all sorts of work. Okay, see, Beckett himself is great in himself, in his own way, and there is, there are all those great writers of our current time. You cannot really pitch them against Dante or Shakespeare because their age was entirely different. The requirements of those age were entirely different than ours. So you cannot put it, pitch this group in against that part, based merely on the kind of writing you see in them. Real versus personal and historic estimate. Again, how do you estimate a certain work? Would be real. It has to be real, as in you need to judge a work for its own way, for its own worth, rather than look into the personal or the historic estimate. Instead of relying on your personal experience or the historic validity of a certain work, you need to look into the work for its own value. Okay, direct contact of the individual with literary grades. Initially says a critic himself alone would be in a best position to show what is good, okay, what has been the best in the world. But then he also concedes this point that it is quite possible that an individual who has to have direct contact with literary grades, or any individual for that matter, should be able to read the literary grades themselves without the medium of the critic. Now we see F.R. Lewis in the 20th century. He was known for a very long running journal called Scrutiny, his Revaluation, the great tradition of one of his critical works. And there were plenty of other writings as well. He brought in a kind of seriousness to English studies that was non existent. I mean, it was discussed to some degree. There were writings concerning the nature of language and literature, but he made it more serious. He brought in a certain seriousness to literary studies and criticism. He believed that for the health of a society, a requirement for the health of a society is a study and appreciation of literature. Again, I believe you see a certain similarity in how Arnold believes that literature could replace religion, and how Leavis believes that literature is a necessity for the health of a society. Well, they all run along the same lines. Of course, this is the core belief of the liberal humanist approach. Valuation, prime concern of criticism. Here, a critic's job is to show what is good. Here, it is the showing part. His showing part is more important, according to Arnold. Lewis believes that a critic's job is to value a literary work. He did not trust abstract thoughts. Abstract thoughts, there are so many, coinages and literary theorizing that do not amount to much. They just end up in vacuum without really, giving a satisfactory answer to the questions they raise. So he says he does not trust those kind of abstract thoughts. He needs concrete evidence. But he himself, did not provide answers to many of his claims. He avoided coining of vocabulary. Generally, theorists tend to coin quite a bit of terms. For instance, Arnold's touchstone, Keats' negative capability, then Coleridge's fancy and imagination. There were so many writers or critics who were known for coining certain literary terms, new terms. But then Leavis used layman terms, as in like life, felt experience, and all that. Leavis' main popularity relies on his combination. Okay, combination of Johnson's moralism and Arnold's social vision and anti-theoretical critical practice. See, Johnson was known for his moralism, Arnold's social vision. So this two combination brought in Lewis to the foray as more of a perfect liberal humanist, and he had an anti-theoretical critical practice. So he did not theorize per se. He more than compensated for his anti-theoretical approach with his criticism. Then we see Edward Armstrong Richards, who was a pioneer of detextualized approach to literature. In detextualized, as in where he removed a certain work from its context, from its authorial or biographical or historical context, and gave it to the students and scholars of his time to analyze them. Okay, so generally when we look at any particular poetry or a particular prose piece, what we do is we first see who wrote it and in what age it was written, and we look at the historical context behind it, when it was written, why it was written, for whom it was written. All of these contribute to a better understanding of a literary work: prose, poetry, novel, short story, or play, anything for that matter. But then Richards brought in this new method where a particular piece is given, without its context, without telling you exactly who wrote it, when it was written, or the age it was written in, or the genre. Of course, you would obviously figure it out without being told. So this taking a certain part of a text out of context and trying to form judgment on it would give you a pure opinion, a pure evaluation, without the interference of the received knowledge or opinion, for that matter. So this Ricardian tradition was seen as the only kind of criticism for a long time. I've written too long time here. Okay, please disregard this. Please ignore this. Ricardian tradition seen as the only kind of criticism for a very long time. We're still following it. Sometimes we are given annotated texts for tests, right? So you tend to form a proper judgment, or at least some understanding of what the text would mean out of context. Now that could lead to certain kind of ambiguity. Now here, William Empson, who was a contemporary of Richards and Leavis, see, these three, Leavis, Richards, and Empson, lived around the same time, and you could call them the three greats probably of the 20th century criticism. So as far as William Empson is concerned, he dealt with the intrinsic reading of texts. He took I. Richards' close reading, detextualized approach to literature a step further and did an ultra close reading and looked at the various verbal difficulties encountered on the way with meticulous surgery of the text. So meticulous surgery of the text, as in he cut them to pieces, wherein he tried to figure out how they looked, what they meant in the absence of a context. And what he found were there so many different kinds of ambiguities existing. Okay? In his work called The 7 Types of Ambiguities, he encounters different ways in which a work could, have multiple meanings. Okay, it could be open to any interpretation, any kind of interpretation. When two things are made to be alike, look alike, when two different metaphors are used at the same time to mean different things, to mean the same thing, or two ideas given through one word or connected by context. Hmm? So sometimes the ideas could, two different ideas could mean the same thing. And sometimes one thing could be expressed in two different ways. And sometimes two things are made to look alike, in a very normal sense. And then sometimes two meanings combine to make a a complication, a complicated idea could be expressed in two different ways. Or while the author is creating, for instance, an author has started writing something with a certain purpose, certain intent, and then all of a sudden he changes tack because he suddenly realizes something else entirely. It is sort of revealed to him in the process of creation, in the process of creativity. He realizes that something else could be said instead of what he started out telling. It happens, right? When even when you're this is something very normal to everyone, but very few of us realize it. We start saying something and end up saying something else entirely. So, and then there are statements that say nothing, so reader has to, draw his own conclusion. For instance, the absence of speech. Okay, say there is a character that says something, that asks something, and the other character does not even answer, but the reader assumes the answer himself with the with the previous, with the next, or with the following situation or action or dialogue, whatever, in whatever sense you do make your own conclusions, despite there being nothing to tell you explicitly. And sometimes two words in context may mean opposite things. In the same context, there might be two words. Okay, one word may have a positive connotation while the other may have negative connotation. So he delineated all the seven ambiguities, and he ended up with this conclusion that language lived in an indeterminate state. So that's how this linguistic indeterminacy came into existence. The idea of linguistic indeterminacy is that language is unreliable. It cannot be determined. Okay, so language is a slippery medium that can explore into meanings, multiple meanings. So even in a normal conversation, normal interaction with your friends and relatives, what happens? Your mom wants to say something and she ends up saying in something entirely different, and you are trying to communicate something to your friend and she misunderstands. We generally say she misunderstood, right? So language itself is a completely unreliable medium for expression. All right. So that's the concept of linguistic indeterminacy. The autobiographical context. Now we are not merely we are here talking about autobiographical context, which is necessary for eliminating ambiguities in a work. But then Empson believed that any context would remove that the various ambiguity we spoke of. Okay, so context, while see, going back, let me tell you, while Richards pioneered detextualization, Empson showed the various forms of ambiguities brought about by detextualization. While it may make the work more complex and more rich in meaning, it provides so many alternate choices for you to interpret and understand a work, right? That is detextualization. But at the same time, sometimes it is so unreliable that you need to find meaning to it. You have to depend on some context, some historical context, biographical context, or any context for that matter. All right. So the basic there was a kind of rift here between the liberal humanists and the critical theorists. F.R. Leavis, whose revaluations that showed close readings of poets, they offered only theoretical vacuum. It was not, spelled out per se. Whereas the critical theorists of the time, René Villec, they He required evidence for the theoretical assumptions that Lewis proposed. At the same time, he was unable to accept liberal humanist simplistic notion of natural. So, anything, the liberal humanism relied largely on the human experience. So they just believe that, okay, so and so a thing is normal, so and so is thing is natural. Yeah, they do not want this notion of natural at all. Who? The critical theorists. And we are specifically talking about René Welleck here. He was a Czech critic. So there was a conflict between the critics and the theorists. Now we'll look into the liberal humanism in practice. I mean, a liberal humanist approach in practice, and it's sort of like working example. For this, we are taking up the Edgar Allan Poe's The Oval Portrait. Now, this is a short story written by Poe, which spoke of a particular um, artist, a painter, who has married this woman, and he wants her to sit for his painting, as in like sit for as a model for his painting. Now he paints and paints and paints, and ultimately, while he is consistently day in and day out creating something on paper, the life of the bride, of his bride, is leaching out of her. Okay, as the art comes to life, the painting diminishes to the extent where she completely finally dies. Okay, so and this particular incident, or this particular story is held within the larger framework of another story where there is an injured officer of the World War who is taking refuge in um, in a chateau in France, probably. And that person is just viewing this army officer. He is just viewing this painting, and along with the painting is the story. Okay, the story of how the woman died while the artist is putting life into the painting. Okay, the painting of his wife. Now, when we look at the liberal humanist approach to this particular work, what we see is there is a conflicting value between art and life. While art is being created, life is being destroyed. Okay. Now, lived life would be the true value. Okay, lived life has a true value, original value, whereas art is a communal reality. Communal reality is necessary for the sustenance of the community. Art is required for the community itself, whereas lived life has original value. When artists begin to see themselves as Faustian superheroes, egotistic, able to cross all boundaries of taste, taboo, and conduct, assuming godlike role of creating and sacrificing life itself, then a hubristic act is committed which ultimately dries up the sources of the life of art itself. So, when artists begin to think themselves as creators, Faustian superheroes would be, you know, assuming themselves to be the creators, the godlike role of creating and sacrificing. They themselves begin to hold, become so egotistic they disregard anything else beyond them. It it dries up the sources of life of art itself. Debased and degenerate form of art, purely aesthetic, no notion of personal and psychic health. What you another understanding you arrive at is that that kind of art that disregards life is debased and degenerate, and it is purely aesthetic. It might give you pleasure, but it does not hold any notion of personal and psychic health. While the artist is creating, a model or replication of his wife, he should have taken into concern her personal and psychic health. Unfortunately, that was not the case. So this may provide purely aesthetic, pleasure, but it's of little value. Two things stand out in this approach. First of all, reading is driven by moral convictions rather than systematic approach to literary criticism. Okay, Reading is based on moral convictions. It is not systematized. Okay. Second, it champions life. Rather than art, liberal humanist believes that art existed for life and it was only secondary to life. Reading bypasses matters of form, structure, genre, etc. So a liberal humanist approach does not really concern itself much. I'm saying much because that's not true in all the cases. So reading bypasses matters of form, structure, genre, etc. It does not concern itself with how it is structured, what form it is in, what genre it belongs to. No, it does not make those observations at all. Now, again, structure, symbol, design, etc., are secondary to the more primary focus on the moral positioning. So, the main concern of a liberal humanist is the morality, the moral part of the work, rather than worry about, okay, they do worry about structure, they do look into the symbolism existent in it, they look at the design in which it has been created, but it is all only secondary. The prime, the prime concern of a liberal humanist critic would be the moral positioning of the work. That is all for today. Hopefully, we'll continue with our next topic in the next video. Thank you. Thank you for your patient listening.